Musk says Grok 4.6 ships any day now. He's already hedging on it. He set the date, then immediately hedged that it could slip a week. Anyone who's watched an AI company promise a launch date before knows how this usually goes. Some deadlines hold. Most, from this specific source, don't. This time, there's a real reason to think it might actually be different. By the end, you'll know exactly what to watch for to tell which one this is. Here's the actual sequence of events. This new version is a 1.5 trillion parameter model, and that number should stop you for a sec, because it's identical to Grok 4.5, the model it's replacing. XAI didn't make this one bigger. It kept the exact same foundation, the same V9 architecture underneath, and poured its effort into something less flashy. Better fine-tuning and reinforcement learning on top of the model it already had. This is a real departure from how XAI has operated. Every Grok release before this one told the same story. More parameters, bigger claims, a louder number to put in the headline. This release breaks that pattern on purpose. Musk first estimated 2 weeks on July 24th, then narrowed that to around August 7th on July 28th. In the same post admitting his own timelines run loose. Worth being precise about what around is doing there. This is Musk hedging his own date before anyone else got the chance to doubt it. Treat it as a strong target, not a guarantee, until XAI's own launch page confirms it. So how do you actually tell a real launch from another slipped date, without refreshing X all day? 4 things happen when a model genuinely ships. Not just gets announced. A real product page goes up with actual specs, not another teaser post. Pricing gets published. Since a model with no price attached almost never means it's actually available yet, independent trackers like Artificial Analysis or LM-RANA start posting real results, which only happens once outsiders can reach the model. And API or app access opens for real, not opens soon. If those 4 line up, the date held. If August 7th passes with still no page, no price, and no outside testing, that's the same pattern that turned 2 weeks into around August 7th in the first place. The company is positioning this release entirely around a different message. This version isn't smarter because it's bigger. It's smarter because it was trained better on the size it already had. That gap sounds small until you consider how much money and time it actually saves. A fresh 1.5 trillion parameter foundation takes months and an enormous compute budget before a single evaluation even runs. Reusing an existing foundation and pouring the effort into fine-tuning instead skips that entire phase. XAI effectively bet that squeezing more capability out of a model it already had would beat waiting for a bigger one to finish, at least for this specific release. Why does that matter more than it sounds like it should? Training a bigger model from scratch is expensive and slow. And there's a ceiling on how much more scale actually helps once a model is already this large. Getting more capability out of the same size, through better fine-tuning instead of more parameters, is a cheaper and faster lever to pull. If it works, XAI gets a smarter model without the cost of building an entirely new foundation. That decision is exactly the kind a company makes when it's trying to move fast without burning through as much compute per gain. Think about what that actually costs in practice, not just in principle. Training a frontier foundation from zero involves months of compute time across tens of thousands of GPUs before a single evaluation even runs. Every attempt that doesn't pan out is a sunk cost with nothing to show for it. Fine-tuning an existing foundation is a fraction of that cost and takes a fraction of the time, since the expensive part, building the base model's raw capability, is already done. That calculation is the same one any lab will start running once the easy scaling gains dry up. This upgrade is what better fine-tuning actually means once you strip away all the marketing language. Supervised fine-tuning is the stage where a model gets shown huge numbers of high-quality examples of the exact kind of task it needs to get better at. Think coding problems solved cleanly, or reasoning chains that reach the right answer. so it learns to imitate that quality more consistently. Reinforcement learning goes a step further. Instead of just imitating examples, the model tries a task itself and gets scored on how well it did. It then adjusts based on that feedback. The same basic loop that trains a person through practice and correction rather than reading a textbook once. Neither of those touches the size of the underlying model. Both can meaningfully change how reliably it performs, which is exactly the bet Grok 4.6 is built on. One piece of infrastructure behind all of this is worth naming, since it's the reason XAI can run two training tracks at once without either one starving the other. XAI Build Colossus, a supercomputer cluster in Memphis that's become one of the largest AI training systems in the world, adding more compute capacity at a pace few other labs can match. It's the resource base making it possible to fine-tune Grok 4.6 while a 2 trillion parameter successor trains in parallel, instead of picking one project and waiting on the other. So, does it actually work? Or is this just a repackaged version of last month's model with a new number attached? The company is positioning the new model to directly challenge two specific rivals. One is Moonshot's Kimi K3, a roughly 2.8 trillion parameter model nearly double Grok's size. The other is Anthropic's Claude Opus 4.8, currently one of the strongest coding models available. Beating a model twice your size without adding a single extra parameter would be a genuinely impressive result. If it holds up under independent testing rather than XAI's own benchmark claims, worth being specific about what beating Opus 4.8 would actually require. Since coding strength isn't one single number, Opus 4.8 currently sits near the top of the SWE bench-verified benchmark, the test that scores a model on real, closed GitHub issues rather than invented puzzles. It's built its reputation on reliability across long, multi-step coding tasks rather than flashy one-shot demos. For Grok 4.6 to genuinely match that, it needs to hold up across that same kind of sustained, multi-step work, winning on a handful of shorter benchmark questions, where a smaller gap in raw capability matters less. Wouldn't be the same achievement. It also helps to see this release against the pace of everything that came before it. Grok 4 launched. Then Grok 4.1 followed within weeks. Then Grok 4, fast for speed-focused use cases. After that came Grok 4.20 with a heavier reasoning focus. Then Grok 4.5 in July as the flagship before this one. That's roughly half a dozen meaningful releases inside a single year. A genuinely unusual cadence, even by this industry's fast-moving standards. This new release isn't a slowdown in that pace. It's the same pace aimed at a different target depth instead of headline size, at least for one release. The same caution worth applying here applies to every launch day claim from any lab. A company's own numbers are a starting point, not a verdict. Kimi K3 shipped with open weights, which means outside researchers can already run their own comparisons against it directly. The new Grok model isn't shipping open. For now, the comparison against Kimi will rest partly on trust until someone outside XAI runs the same tests once it's actually available. That open versus closed gap matters more than it might seem on the surface. When a lab publishes open weights, anyone with the right hardware can run the exact same tests the company ran and check the numbers themselves. That's exactly what happened with Kimi K3 within days of its release. A closed model can still be tested through its API, but that only shows you the outputs, not the underlying weights. So, certain kinds of independent verification simply aren't possible yet, until XAI changes that, or a third party runs enough API-based tests to build real confidence. The comparison against Kimi stays one-sided. That's true no matter how the launch materials frame it. Here's where this story gets bigger than a single model update. Grok 4.6 isn't really the headline. Think of it as the placeholder instead. Musk has already confirmed that XAI's next model, built on second trillion parameters, has finished its initial training run and could be ready for broader release within the same month. This is a 33% jump in scale over the 1.5 trillion foundation currently powering both Grok 4.5 and this new release. Musk described the upcoming model as better in every way, and said it might be able to exceed Kimi K3 outright once evaluation wraps up in the coming weeks. Read that timeline carefully, because it tells you something about how XAI is actually operating right now. They're aiming to ship a same size, better trained model, while a much larger successor is already finished training behind it. That's not a company that ran out of ideas and settled for a smaller update. It's a company running two strategies in parallel. Squeeze more value out of the current size while the next size class finishes cooking. Whichever one performs better in the real world will likely define which strategy XAI leans on next. That kind of dual bet only makes sense for a company with enough compute to run both tracks without one starving the other. That's the kind of position only a handful of labs on Earth are actually in right now. This two-track approach says something about where the entire AI industry is heading, not just XAI specifically. For most of the last few years, the story was simple. Bigger model, better score. Next headline. This release is a signal that at least one major lab thinks that formula is running out of easy wins. And that training quality is becoming as important a lever as raw size. If that's true industry-wide and not just an XAI experiment, it changes what the next big model actually means going forward. The number in the headline might start mattering less than what a company actually did with the size it already had. There's a wider pattern worth naming here. Since Grok isn't the only lab making this exact bet right now, Anthropic's own recent Opus releases have leaned similarly on refinement over raw scale, chasing coding and reasoning gains through training method rather than a bigger parameter count each time. Two labs with very different corporate cultures are independently converging on the same strategy. That's a stronger signal than either company making the bet alone, suggesting the entire field may be hitting the same wall on scale at roughly the same moment. There's a cost angle buried in this too, worth pulling out on its own. The same size model that gets smarter through better training is cheaper to run than a bigger model would have been, since inference cost scales with the number of parameters actually doing work on each request. If this model genuinely closes the gap with larger rivals while staying at 1.5 trillion parameters, XAI ends up with something that costs less to serve at scale. That's less than a true 2 trillion parameter jump would have cost. That's a meaningful advantage in a market where every major lab is currently cutting prices, not raising them. Put a real number on that advantage instead of leaving it abstract. OpenAI cut its own mid-tier model's price by 80% within the last 2 weeks. Multiple labs are now racing each other down on cost per token, not just racing each other up on capability. A model that delivers rival-level performance without the inference bill of a genuinely larger foundation is exactly the kind of asset that lets a company undercut competitors on price without eating the loss itself. Whether that turns into an actual price cut on Grok's own tiers is something worth watching over the next few weeks, not something confirmed by this launch alone. So, is this model actually beating Kimi K3 and matching Claude's coding strength, or is XAI managing expectations ahead of a bigger release? Both things can be true depending on which task you're asking about. The company's own claims point to real gains in coding, reasoning, and agent tasks specifically, areas where fine-tuning tends to help more than raw scale does anyway. The same size model claiming to beat a rival with nearly double the parameters is exactly the kind of claim that deserves outside verification. It shouldn't get repeated as settled fact, the same way the Quan and DeepSeek claims from other labs didn't either. One more angle worth pulling in here. Since it's one of the few genuine differentiators, none of Grok's rivals can simply copy by training harder. Real-time access. Grok pulls live information directly from X, which means it can answer questions about events from the last few hours in a way a model trained on a fixed cutoff simply can't. That won't show up on SWE bench or terminal bench as a score. it's still a real capability gap that matters enormously for anyone using an AI assistant to track breaking news, markets, or live conversation. It's also a lane where a same-size training refinement can compound an advantage no amount of Claude or Kimmy's raw reasoning power currently closes. Set that against what Anthropic has been doing with its own recent releases. Since the contrast is instructive, Claude's flagship updates have consistently prioritized reliability and careful reasoning over flashy real-time features, betting that consistency on high-stakes tasks matters more to its user base than knowing what happened an hour ago. Neither approach is objectively correct. They're different bets on what actually matters to the people paying for access. Doubling down on real-time access while chasing coding parity through fine-tuning is XAI trying to have both advantages in the same release, rather than picking one lane and committing fully. That skepticism cuts both ways, though, and it's worth applying evenly rather than only toward the labs if you are already distrusts. If independent testing eventually confirms Grok 4.6 does hold up against Kimi K3 on real tasks, that's a legitimately impressive result for a model that didn't grow a single extra parameter to get there. The point isn't to assume every launch claim is wrong. It's to wait for someone outside the company to check before treating any of them as settled, XAI included. What actually matters here isn't whether this specific version wins the comparison. The real story is the pattern underneath the release. XAI is now running a smaller, cheaper, better trained model alongside a much bigger one still in development, testing both approaches at once instead of betting everything on scale alone. It's a more interesting strategic story than any single benchmark number, and it's the one worth watching as the 2 trillion model gets closer to release. If you're trying to decide whether this actually changes anything for you right now, the honest answer is not yet. Not until the 2 trillion model actually ships and someone outside XAI runs real comparisons against Kimi K3 and Claude directly. What it does tell you is which direction XAI is willing to bet its resources on next. And that's worth tracking even before the bigger model lands. For developers specifically, the practical advice is straightforward. Don't switch your daily coding tool based on this announcement alone. Wait for independent benchmark runs on real repositories, not launch day comparisons from the company shipping the model. If Claude is already working for you, rough parity from a same-size Grock update isn't yet reason enough to migrate. For anyone using AI mainly for research, writing, or staying current on fast-moving topics, Grock's real-time access remains the more relevant differentiator than its coding claims. That's true whether or not it ultimately beats Kimi K3 on a benchmark chart, since a live feed of current events isn't something a benchmark score captures well in the first place. Match the tool to the actual job, the same principle from every comparison video on this channel, rather than picking whichever model won the latest headline. That same matching principle applies to the price angle sitting underneath this whole release. Worth returning to before wrapping up. A cheaper-to-run model that holds its own against pricier rivals is only a genuine win if it's actually solving your specific task well, not just cheaply. A developer choosing between a same-size Grock update and a pricier Claude subscription should weigh the real cost of a wrong answer on their specific work, not just the sticker price difference between the two. That's the same lesson from the DeepSeek and workflow comparison videos on this channel, applied again here. Cheaper only wins when it's not also worse at the thing you actually need it to do. That principle will outlast whichever model happens to be winning the headline race this particular week. Keep one number in mind while you wait for that confirmation. 33%. The scale jump between this smaller version and what's already finished training behind it. Both a hit and a miss on that bet would actually tell you something real and concrete about the strategy behind it. If the smaller, cheaper model genuinely holds its own against rivals nearly double its size, the case for training quality over raw scale gets stronger across the whole industry, not just at XAI. If it doesn't, The 2 trillion model becomes the real test of whether XAI can still win on scale alone once it actually needs to. Either outcome tells you something concrete about the strategy, which is more than most launch day headlines actually deliver. Next video, we're checking back the moment that 2 trillion model actually ships, to see whether better in every way holds up once it's not just Musk's own description of it anymore. Until then, treat every claim on both sides of this comparison, XAI's and its rivals, as a starting point rather than a final verdict. Judge each tool by what it actually does on your own work, not by which number won the latest headline.